social cognition and groupthink. And so I'd like to introduce Adam Karp, who's a junior, who's a neuroscience major.
Probably turn this on, that would be helpful. Okay, so my talk is about groupthink. Groupthink goes by tons of names. There's collective consciousness, groupthink obviously, group consciousness, social consciousness, group unity, all sorts of different ways to do it. But generally, if somebody is asked about groupthink, one of the first examples they'll think of are lemmings. So I like to start by talking about lemmings. Back in the late 1950s, Disney produced a wildlife film about the lemmings, and they're basically these little furry fuzzballs that wander around, and as you're going to see, they jump off cliffs. So let's watch it. I find it really funny that every time I show this video to people, they end up laughing, because really it's a video of mass suicide. But, basically, these lemmings are undergoing groupthink. So let's just define groupthink quickly. Groupthink is sort of that moment when everyone is doing the same thing, having the same body language maybe, even saying the same thing, for a reason that may be unbeknownst to them. And while we just saw this in lemmings, it obviously exists in all sorts of other animals. We see birds and sheep. We see all sorts of examples of it, but it also exists all over the place in humans. One primary example that I always think of is the bystander effect from during the Holocaust. Back then, civilians just sort of went with the propaganda and supported the political climate without necessarily thinking for themselves on it. Another example, riots that take place. The top picture is from 2012 in China, the Foxconn riot. The bottom picture is from the poll tax riot in London. Both of those are people doing the same thing at the same time, in unison. Yet another example, if you may remember it, a couple years ago on Black Friday, a Walmart employee was trampled by a mob of people rushing into the store. This is a picture from that. But not all examples of groupthink are necessarily violent. It's important to remember that. Prayer is another great example of it. You've got a group of people in the same space, all doing the same thing once again. Or waiting in line. When we're waiting in line, we all end up copying each other's body language. Or if you ever notice when you go to the movie theater, and let's say there's two places to get tickets, both of them are equally good. You can get the same tickets to the same movie at either one, but one of them always has a line, the other one doesn't. Why do we always mob to the same one that has the line? Another one, traffic. Traffic is really similar to that, except in this case, the body is sort of extended out to the car. In this picture, you can actually see it even better. There's two lanes these cars could be going down, and they're all focused on the same lane. Or sitting in a movie theater. We're all sitting there watching the movie at one time. We're all doing the exact same thing. Seeing an interview. Interviews, there's a lot of studies that have shown that when two people are having extended conversation together, they end up mirroring each other's body language. You can see that in the picture with the interviewers. They all have their arms crossed on the table, and they're all just sort of, they all have a nice little classic smile on, like I'm not really enjoying what you're saying, but... So, as you can see, groupthink is a really common thing across species, and it's really, I think it's safe to say that groupthink is everywhere. So one really popular example that I like to think of when I'm talking about groupthink is back when I was a kid, my mom's going to hate me for saying this, back when I was a kid, my mom used to always ask me every time a situation of peer pressure came up, if your friends all were to jump off of a bridge, would you? And I think that really encapsulates the idea of groupthink, and that really encapsulates our common sense idea of it. Because that question right there implies imitation. It implies that if I was going to jump off the bridge too, then I was copying my friends and doing it. And that is definitely our common sense idea of what groupthink is. I think if I were to ask all of you at the beginning of this talk what groupthink is, every one of you would have said imitation. And that's the same thing with neuroscientists. If you were to ask neuroscientists what groupthink was involved in, they'd go with imitation. And the primary neural correlate for imitation, and thus groupthink, as of right now, is mirror neurons. Mirror neurons were first found in chimpanzees, and they ended up finding that if chimpanzees observed actions of other chimps, different regions of the brain were activated than if they'd performed those actions on their own. And so that came together, and they decided to call those mirror neurons. Mirror neurons exist throughout the brain. They exist in all different regions of the brain. The most popular that you'll probably hear about the most are in the motor cortex, which is usually responsible for when we actually move. One study in humans that showed this was from 1998. They had an individual in a neuromagnetic imaging device, so they can get a nice little picture of their brain, like we have right here, and they watched somebody else fiddling with an object. So just doing random things with the object, just fiddling. And those people that were not doing anything, they were sitting perfectly still, had activation right in that circle that I highlighted. Just to put in perspective, you can see the eyes over there on the far side, the back of the head. The part that's activated, though, that's the motor cortex. There's a spatial map there that really dictates, very specifically to the point of body part, to a single finger, what part of the body is moving. So why is it that when they were observing something, mirror neurons were activating and they were seeing activity there? Feel free to yawn. I'm not going to be offended. You can. I mean, if you don't, then I'd be a little bit worried, actually. Yes, we got one. Yawning is another great example of groupthink, specifically in the form of contagious yawning. Like you guys just saw, it's just the fact that I have this picture on the screen right now of somebody yawning is making so many people yawn right now. It's great. We should leave it there for a while. But whenever you hear somebody talking about yawning, whenever you see somebody else yawn, we got another one, we have such a greater urge to yawn ourselves. So there was a study done a couple years ago where they decided to try and find some sort of neural correlate for that. So they put people in an fMRI machine. You guys heard about fMRI earlier. It's basically a brain imaging technique that shows activation in certain areas of the brain while certain tasks are being completed. So they had subjects sit in the fMRI machine while they watched one of two videos. First video was and it's an actor doing random facial movements, you see right here, the control. Second one was of the same person actually yawning. And the first thing they asked afterwards was, did they feel like they were more tempted to yawn? And every time, across the board, they all said yes. There was no question about that. But then the other side of it was the areas of the brain that they saw. Now, based on our common sense idea of groupthink, I think it's easy to say the hypothesis there should be that we'd see mirror neurons activating. We'd see something in the motor cortex. Interestingly, though, that's not what we saw. This is the figure from the study. And on the top, you can see just the fMRI of the different, let me get the little pointer thing. Might make it a little clearer. The top, maybe top you can see like just the composite brain activations. In the middle you see one region that they select as particularly relevant. In the bottom you can see the other one. Can't really point to the tie, but right here would be where the motor cortex would be. And we don't see anything there. So something else is obviously happening. So what areas of the brain do they see? The middle ones, the area shown is the amygdala. The amygdala is one of the primary emotional centers of the brain. The amygdala is responsible for emotionally relevant information, like fear, like anything that you're feeling in the present, in the moment. On the bottom, you see that they have the STS highlighted, superior temporal sulcus, another big emotional center in the brain, which is usually seen as being responsible for figuring out where other people's emotions are directed. So yes, that definitely has to do with other people, but again, we're not seeing anything with mirror neurons. We're not seeing anything with the imitation side. We're seeing all emotional stuff. This wasn't just one study that found this. There's another study on mental rotation, where they had the subjects sit again in an fMRI machine, and they were asked to look at a figure like this, and basically say whether or not those two figures were the same. They had to mentally rotate them and figure out if they could be superimposed. First times they did it, they just did it from that, no other additional qualities to it. Afterwards, though, they put on the side the opinions of other individuals to give a peer pressure sort of side of it, see social conformity. And when that happened, they didn't have a great figure in this one of the fMRI, so I don't have that up here. But when that happened, again, they saw the amygdala showing up. And they also saw the parietal lobe, which parietal lobe also has a lot of emotional aspects to it. But again, there was nothing with mirror neurons. There was no evidence of that. It was all, again, emotional things. So why could that be? I would suggest that perhaps our common sense ideology or theory of what groupthink is it wrong. Perhaps it's not actually imitation. Perhaps it's an emotional contagion. So what does that mean? Like we said before, imitation is the act, practice, or art of imitating. It's mimicry. It's explicit. It's something we choose to do. If you have kids sitting together and one of them decides to be a copycat and just imitate what the other ones always do, aside from frustrating everyone, they're choosing to do it. If I decided to imitate Dr. Teissere now, I'll be going like this. I'm making a complete voluntary decision to do that. On the other hand, an emotional contagion is a spread. It's the spread of an emotional or mental state among a number of people. It's involuntary. It's implicit. We don't have any control over it. And so I'd argue that actually is much more reflective of our experience of groupthink. Just to go over that again. The idea of explicit versus the idea of implicit. I think that's really where our ideologies behind what groupthink is drives down to. We always say that's an explicit thing. Perhaps it's not. So let's jump back a second to jumping off bridges. If you're in a situation of peer pressure and all of your friends are doing something, whether you go to do it or not, you don't necessarily have a moment where you say, I'm going to do that because all my friends are doing it. You just end up doing it. You don't have that. If it was an imitation, I'd argue that you should have that definitive moment where in your mind you decide, I'm going to take that action. That doesn't happen. So, to jump back even further, we can go talk about the lemmings again. Because they're so much fun. The lemmings, there's a little bit more to the video than I told you guys before. When that video was made, that was presented just like I presented to you earlier. But after it came out, there was another revelation that came out of the video, where actually those lemmings were not just jumping off the cliff, because that's just what they do with their lives. On the other hand, Disney film crew was actually chasing lemmings off the cliff. Off camera, you can't see it, but they were actually chasing them off. So I'm going to show a clip from that same video again, with no sound this time, and let's see if we maybe get a different perception of it. Notice no one's laughing there. You see, all these lemmings are still going off the cliff in the exact same way, but now we have the added component that we realize they're experiencing some sort of really prevalent emotion. They're experiencing fear. One of those, they're in a situation where a predator, the film crew, is chasing them. and they're afraid, and thus they're just going. If you were in an evolutionary situation and you're trying to get away from a predator, and you see one of your herd going, you're not going to want to take the moment and stop and think, okay, what's going on here? Why is this a thing? Like, you're just going to want to go. You're not going to want to stop and take that extra pause. So the fact that they're just going based on an emotion, I think that goes back to the story. They're not imitating each other to jump off the cliff. They're having an emotional backing to it. It's an emotional contagion. It's that implicit drive. So there's one other example of groupthink that I think is really quite important to talk about, and I feel like it would be remiss not to. And that would be the audience itself, right here. I feel like it's getting a camera angle, so we got to shot Dr. Teissere. But right now, as you guys all sit here, everyone's sitting quietly, looking at me, hopefully taking in every word I say, and in the same position. No one's sitting and facing the back of the room. There's no person running around the corner. There's no one doing it. Everyone's following the same social norm. And if I were to ask you right now, raise your hand if you feel like you're imitating the person next to you. You don't think like, oh, I'm like you two right now. You guys are sitting the exact same way. You guys are both like slouched the exact same way. You're not imitating each other. So just another example. Can I ask everyone right now, except for you, Dr. Teissere, to raise your hand? Just leave it like that for a second. Do you feel comfortable? I'll take it as a yes, I guess. You guys put your hands up. But the fact that there's a discomfort with regard to a lack of social conformity, I think that just further emphasizes the point that there's an emotional tie to this. There's an emotional tie to what groupthink is. And perhaps our common sense perception of it is wrong. So what? So what does all this mean? Why do I care if groupthink is implicit rather than explicit? Well, first off, sociology has been saying this for years. This is old news. Sociology has been saying for years that we are influenced by the society around us, and it manifests through our actions in a completely implicit way. That's really what I'm arguing right now, but from a different perspective. On top of that, if we have the wrong idea of something that's so prevalent in our culture, of something that's so ever-present that we experience all the time, walking down academic row, everyone's in the same rows, and no one's running ahead, no one usually, unless you're late for class. But everyone's in the same exact fashion walking down academic row. It exists everywhere. So if we have the wrong ideology of what that is, then maybe it can be helpful to try and look at it in a different light, to try and look at it from the perspective of from a different perspective, and try and get a better picture of what it really is that's happening. And on top of that, to go back to the lemmings, but the whole idea of the lemmings having that evolutionary run for their lives, that would happen in humans too. If humans were in a wildlife situation where there was a predator coming after us, we wouldn't necessarily want to stop and take a moment to pause and think like, okay, what's going on here? We're going to get eaten then. But perhaps that has another tie to society today. Even though we don't have a formal predator coming after us, perhaps the idea of social conformity as an implicit thing that's automatic, that we don't necessarily think about, really does tie in with everything else. So with that, I'll switch it out of this so we can decrease the tension